thank you for the opportunity of being with you this morning. And the first thing I want to say is an apology for having come rather late and having to go rather early. It's a very bad habit of speakers at events, and I put my hand up and admit my guilt and ask for your absolution. It's just a diary which is a bit out of hand. But thank you anyway for the opportunity of spending such time as is possible with you. And I've been asked to talk a bit rather generally about the soul, which is one of those "how long have you got" subjects, really. And yes, as Mark very kindly mentioned, I've written a little book called Passions of the Soul, and I'll be referring a little bit to that, but I want to move out a bit more generally into the dangerously broad question of what we actually mean when we use the language of the soul. The old convention, which talks about body and soul as, so to speak, the hard stuff and the woozy stuff, really needs to be unscrambled. That's a model, that basic dualism, which, on the whole, didn't really take over until relatively late in the intellectual and imaginative history of Europe, let alone the rest of the world. Much more typical of the non-European world and the pre-modern Western world was a picture of our human reality, and indeed more than just our human reality, that might be described as a sort of plural awareness of a single phenomenon. We as human beings, as human agents and human thinkers, operate at different levels, not as different things, not as different subjects, not that we have a little person inside our heads doing stuff, but the complex reality that we are works in a variety of different ways, a variety of different kinds of relationship with and response to our environment. And that's really where I'd like to start. The idea of my life and yours being a cluster of styles of responding and relating to where we are. And if you think about the old-style language of body and soul, or indeed body, soul, and spirit, more about that in a moment, perhaps you can make sense of how that works. Quite clearly, because we are material stuff, we need ways of responding and relating to other bits of stuff. If we don't have strategies about how we relate to other bits of stuff, we bump into things. And one of the first lessons that a baby learns is how not to bump into things. The first level of intelligent behavior is an intelligent body, which inhabits styles and protocols and habits of responding and relating to a world where we simply have to find our way around in a material environment. But obviously, as soon as you've said that and talked about the intelligent life of the body, you realize that that's already taking for granted a slightly different level of responding and relating, a pattern building responding. We not only develop habits of not bumping into things, we guess and we imagine things we might bump into, things we have bumped into, and also we begin to understand that not bumping into things requires us to think about our own thinking, remembering, and feeling. We reflect on ourselves. We begin to tell ourselves stories about ourselves. We make patterns in our memory. We learn to respond not just to bits of stuff, but to patterns of action, behavior, the initiative taken by others towards us. We learn to respond a bit to what's going on within us and to make better sense of it. And as we do that, Here comes the third level. As we do that, part of our responding and relating begins to open out onto something still more mysterious and searching and strange. And that is opening out to the deep rhythms of things, not just the physical patterns, but the deep rhythms of things that are beyond what immediately can be sort of crystallized and talked about in terms of bodily interactions, ultimately opening out to whatever resource, energy, can we even say grace, that there is, penetrating, suffusing, pervading all that is around us, not containable within any one situation, not able to be tied down to any one phenomenon. Human lives, it seems, work, very broadly speaking, at those three levels of responding and relating. The basic skills of not bumping into things, the slightly more complicated skills of understanding and responding to what comes to us and the awareness of what's going on within us, the opening out into the rhythms, the currents that run through everything, and whatever question mark lies beyond all that. And when we've said that, we've said something roughly corresponding to what a lot of ancient philosophers in the Western world, and a lot of early Christian writers, not to mention writers and thinkers outside the European tradition, have described as body, soul, and spirit. Body, soul, and spirit. We are inexorably, irreducibly physical. Our bodies matter, but they're bodies, they're not just lumps of stuff, they don't just lie around. They move, they interact. And a body is already an intelligent system. I suppose that's one of the things that has most been drummed into us in the last few decades, that the idea of dead matter is a dead idea. Dead matter doesn't exist. The material world is always intelligently engaged, interactive. And then what earlier writers and earlier traditions meant by soul wasn't some kind of immaterial, separate, alternative world. Soul was very much the sense-making, continuity-bearing bit of us, making sense of the body, working with the body's intelligence to make a story, to make a continuous set of policies and projects in our world. And spirit, sometimes rather misleadingly translated as intellect, that's the deepest level at which we find ourselves attuned to the fullness of what's around us. Not just patterns of behavior, not just regularities in things, not just our own inner world, but that to which we have to be, ultimately, in tune, in touch. Now, in a way, the interesting part of our selfhood is that middle level of soul. Understanding, or trying to understand what's going on within us, working out something about our intentions, our habitual modes of engagement with the world around us, and also, of course, understanding where those things go wrong, become limiting, damaging, even toxic. And without that understanding of what's going on within us, something of our capacity for a deeper attunement to things doesn't come alive fully. Or to put it in rather more sort of stark terms, sorting out the passions of the soul, sorting out what's going on at that middle level, is something to do with clearing the space for a fuller attunement to the deeper reality that pervades everything. The eternal, the divine, the sacred, call it what you will. And within our Western philosophy, within the early Christian and indeed Jewish and Muslim worlds, that threefold pattern, that kind of diagnosis of our situation is, in the classical literature of these traditions, at the heart of how we make sense of where we are. And one of the sadnesses, really, in the Western cultural world is how much we've lost sight of the deep resourcefulness of that kind of analysis of who we are and how we work. And how, especially in the early modern world, I look at John Locke's slide here with some dismay here. In the early modern world, all this is broken down to a crude stuff and solid stuff and woozy stuff, binary, which still affects us in popular thinking about science and about knowledge, but that's another story. Let's focus a bit more for the moment on how some of this is broken down in some of the literature I discussed in this little book, and which has been much more effectively and extensively discussed by a lot of better scholars. But the picture is something like this. At the very centre of what we are is this capacity for what I've called attunement. Very happy to start with singing this morning, because I think the musical analogy is really one of the very best ones that we have for the whole process of understanding. Attunement. We somehow step into, make our own, a rhythm, a current, as I called it earlier, a stream of differentiated energy into which we can move and in which we swim. Swimming and music are two of the very best analogies, I think, for spiritual life and intellectual life in their fullness. And you'll perhaps understand a bit more as I go on why I say that. And that capacity for attunement, that's at the centre of it all. And it doesn't go away. We may ignore it, we may choke it, we may try to suppress it, we may make light of it, but there is in us what's sometimes been described as a kind of magnetic feeling for, quivering towards that level of being in tune. And so often, classical and pre-modern writers will talk about our knowing of the world much more in terms like that than in terms of the spotlight fixed on an object out there which we carve up for our own purposes and then file in our systems. The very word intellect, as several medieval philosophers remind us, is all about reading from inside. It's about getting into the current, the rhythm of something, so that its form, its shape, actually becomes yours. In one of T.S. Eliot's famous lines, "You are the music while the music lasts." You are the music while the music lasts. And that image could apply to any kind of knowing of reality. So that's the deepest thing. Intellect, as we use the word, is useless as a name for this. The Greeks called it the nous, N-O-U-S, and the way they use the word is a lot more like what we might call intuition than what we usually mean by intellect. Again, intuition, getting inside something, or letting it get inside you. Sharing, participation, being in the same movement of energy. So far so good, but of course that central, fundamental capacity to be in tune is a bit fragile, a bit vulnerable in a world of change and uncertainty. And we learn to cope with change and uncertainty in a lot of very different ways, some of them positive and some of them definitely not so positive. And when ancient philosophers and sometimes early Christian writers talk about passion, that's essentially what they mean. Somewhere in that, what I call that middle level of broadly coping with a complex world of other persons as well as natural phenomena, somewhere in that middle level, there are quite a lot of disturbances, imbalances, that in fact get in the way of our proper attunement with the real. So when writers in that tradition, whether Stoics, Platonists, early Christians, Hellenistic Jews, early medieval Muslims, when they write about the passions of the soul, the disturbances of the soul, they mean those kinds of imbalance, those kinds of upsetting the equilibrium that get in the way of yielding to the deep currents of reality, that get in the way of joining in the music. So, on the specifics, the little book I mentioned is partly inspired by the work of some of those early Christian writers of the, say, 4th to 6th century, who try to catalogue the various ways in which imbalances occur. They identify 8 main ways in which the balance can be upset and our relation with everything can be made unfruitful, unharmonious, and, to use a very important image that occurs in a lot of this literature, ways in which we are kept from seeing clearly. Very interesting that the word that's thrown around a lot in this context, in early Christian writing in Greek, is theoria. Not theory, but looking, gazing. Contemplating, even. Theoria becomes one of the standard Greek words for contemplation. Our state of attunement is a state of seeing clearly, as well as participating in rhythm. And, as we'll see in a moment, there are different kinds of theoria, different kinds of seeing, which need to be clarified for us to get to that point of maximal openness, to maximal vulnerability to the real. The 8 passions of the soul are the things that stop us seeing what is in front of our noses. Now, by a mysterious and not terribly helpful process, the 8 passions of the soul in Greek Christian thought turned into the 7 deadly sins in Western theological thinking. And that's, in many levels, a bit of a pity, because the analysis given by the early Christian writers of the passions of the soul is not about sins. It's not about there being 7 fundamentally wrong kinds of action that deserve condemnation. It's about there being 8 kinds of pathology of the self which can distort our vision. And to me, that's part of what makes this tradition so very interesting and so very timely. Timely in the sense that we still live in a cultural world which is in an amazing muddle about guilt and innocence, about truth and falsity, about what constitutes authentic humanity, and so on and so on. But in the context, as I say, these bits of analysis are about habits that make us more the victim of circumstances than we need to be. So dealing with the passions of the soul, getting beyond these habits, these instinctual default setting responses to what lies around us, is becoming free. Not free in the kind of consumer market sense, so I can have what I want, but just free to go with the flow of reality. Stop fighting it, I might say, is one of the things that this tradition says. Stop fighting it. You are putting enormous energy into being unreal. You're putting colossal, sophisticated resources to work to prevent yourself being natural. Just recognize the oddity of that as you think it through. So, what are we talking about in terms of these 8 passions of the soul? There are various ways of listing them, and I mention in the book some of those distinctions, but the general view is that the beginning of the problem is pride. Pride, not in the sense of being proud of achievements or whatever, but pride very much in the sense of self-sufficiency. I am in charge. That's where the problems start. I am in charge. And if I'm not in charge, I think I ought to be. And if I ought to be and I'm not, then, to battle with others, with myself, with the world around. There's a very nice word used in some Greek writing, avtotis, literally selfless, not selfishness, but selfless. That is the assumption that my ego has the God-given right to be on the top of every situation, to be able to organize it according to what I think my priorities are, should be. So when people say, in this tradition, pride is the root of all sin, they're not encouraging us to have, let's say, an unrealistically modest or even humiliating picture of what we are. They're not trying to do us down as human beings. They're saying, beware of the idea that the fundamental truth about you is a right to be in charge. And therefore, beware of the assumption that you have all the resources you need to connect in a life-giving way with the world you inhabit. That's why pride is where it starts. Somewhere in all this is something to do, the first chapter of the little book is subtitled The Truth of Dependence. Paradoxically, we learn our freedom by learning how to depend in a healthy and life-giving way. I need to be fed. I needn't be ashamed of needing to be fed. To be fed, literally, is where we all start. To be fed, to be given life, is at the heart of growing and flourishing. So don't panic about dependence. To learn to be fed, to be instructed, to be enlarged by the world you're in, by other people, that's the counterpart, if you like, of pride, the assumption that I ought to be in control, and therefore that I needn't depend on anything. You may remember the joke about the Englishman prides himself on being a self-made man, thereby relieving God of a frightful responsibility. It's a joke much more popular with the Welsh for some strange reason than with the English. The Welsh, as you may remember from the same joke, the Welsh are the people who pray on their knees on Sundays and on their neighbours on weekdays. So, one other aspect, though, of pride is that there are the strange kind of negative mirror image of it, which is a second passion of the soul, and that's what's sometimes called listlessness in the tradition. Listlessness. The focus on the self, in that way, the focus on the self and its capacity, the reluctance to be dependent, that can actually manifest itself in the kind of whatever frame of mind. A sort of indifference to my own feeling and the feeling of others. A sort of deliberately cultivated emotional illiteracy about where I am. I don't want to take the risk of investing my feelings too strongly in things. And I don't really believe in the way other people invest their feelings in things. I stand back. They that have power to hurt and will do none, who will not do the thing they most do show, one of Shakespeare's most disturbing sonnets. That's about listlessness. It's about that shrug of the shoulders that says, I'm not going to be bothered by the world. And that's very different from the condition of what is confusingly called in the literature apatheia. Not apathy, but the lack of, sorry, not apathy, but the freedom from passion. And I'll say more about that later. So this state of listlessness, idleness, self-oriented fantasy, that also becomes a very important focus for how these writers in the early tradition think about the pathologies of the soul. So pride, listlessness, self-oriented, self-confidence, a fear of dependence and a fear of commitment. Those are the first two, many of the lists that appear. And the analysis of how they work in the life of those people in the early church trying to lead ascetical monastic lives, the analysis is very acute and sometimes even quite funny. The description of listlessness as the noonday demon, that is the sort of spirit that comes over you halfway through the day when it's a bit hot and nothing much seems to be happening. If you think of monks in the desert in the early days where, hot noondays, nothing much happening is very much what you had to get used to. Evagrius, Cassian, the other great writers of the period, have these rather wonderful descriptions of the monk as the sun rises higher in the sky, sitting in his cell, twiddling his thumbs and thinking, I'm sure somebody needs a visit from me. I'm sure somebody would be really grateful to see me. Let's go and visit one of the other monks in their cell because, I'm going to do them good. Or they start thinking, what a wonderful life I could have in the world with my gifts, my spiritual insight, my profound experience. What am I doing wasting my life in the desert? I could be out there transforming society. And Evagrius Cassian has just analysed these little fantasies bit by bit as aspects of listlessness, in that actually, for all that they dress themselves up as concern for others and concern for the world, really arise from a lack of commitment, a lack of being able to sit with yourself where you are. Was it Descartes who said that all the problems of humankind derive from the difficulty people find in sitting on their own for a quarter of an hour? Something like that. And then moving on to what look like more familiar forms of what we might analyse as sin. There's anger. And I noted in the book that in some of this literature, anger is almost something for which these writers have a bit of a soft spot, because anger can be rather a good thing at times. There are things you damn well ought to be angry about, say these writers. You ought to be angry about the suffering and injustice around you. You ought to be angry sometimes at your own listlessness and pride. You ought to look at yourself and say, oh, it's well. Anger has a good use. Anger, at best, is a protest against a passive response to the world. But, hold on. Anger can become something deeply enjoyable. There's nothing quite as satisfying as really righteous anger. So just keep an eye on that, will you? Ask, what's this anger really about? Is it the anger of real protest? This should not be. I cannot resign myself to a world like this. Or is it about, this is something that makes me feel more right than I've ever felt in my life? And we see, of course, how the appeal to anger is so regularly an appeal to injured righteousness. And I just leave you with the two words, Donald and Trump. on that one. Let's not go there this morning. But anger, which essentially is serving the ego yet again, which is feeding it that greedy passion to be on top of things, and in this instance to be right at everyone else's expense. Keep an eye on that, say these writers. And it was expressed beautifully in a book I read years ago by a Catholic missionary working in Africa, who wrote this very challenging book about the role of Mary in the Christian imagination, writing from the point of view of a very sort of conflict-ridden and poverty-stricken African context. Anger is very appropriate in this, but at one point he imagines Mary saying to him, as a missionary, as a worker, an advocate for African rights, Mary saying to him, "Who is your anger serving? Who is your anger serving? Who's this for?" And whenever we're inclined to give way to righteous anger, that question, who's this for? What's this about? Is a good one to drop in. Similarly, where gluttony is concerned, the fourth passion of the soul, the writers say, just as with anger, look, it happens. Your emotions are engaged, you feel angry. Your body needs food. Of course it does. And it's not surprising if both of those from time to time get a bit out of proportion. But gluttony can become yet another way of asserting control. If it gets out of hand, out of control, it becomes, again, a kind of obsessive need to be on top of the situation. I will never be needy. I will never allow myself to feel unfulfilled. I will be grasping to pull it all into this great internal void. And gluttony, where food and drink are concerned, is really just the tip of the iceberg. If you find yourself thinking too much about food and drink, again thinking of monks in the desert who are quite likely to be thinking about food and drink in a rather, let's say, austere lifestyle, you find yourself obsessing about baked beans and about when the next meal is coming and whether there'll be a little bit extra wine for you. Monastic life in the 4th century. If that's taking up a lot of mental space and emotional space, step back, have a look at that. What's going on? Isn't this again about this grabbing, stuffing it in? Beware. I'm delighted to find that in John Cassian's analysis of gluttony, he mentions a passing phrase in, I think, the book of Ezekiel, which refers to the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Why was Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed? Well, lots of Christians over the centuries have known perfectly well why they think Sodom was destroyed. And Cassian says very firmly, Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed because of gluttony. You think, pardon? Ezekiel says these were cities that were destroyed because they had abundance of bread. They didn't share, they hoarded, they stuffed the void of what they wanted. That was the real sin of Sodom. As I say, not a majority view over the centuries, but it's an interesting sidelight. And gluttony is very closely connected with the fifth of the issues here, which is avarice. And these writers will talk about avarice as being a bit like gluttony, in that it's something to do with wanting to protect yourself against an unknown future. Avarice is miserliness. It's storing up what will protect you so that you don't have to feel insecure. So it's not just about gaining wealth. It's about gaining wealth so as not to want, not to risk. And that, again, is deeply unsafe place to be, spiritually, because, in fact, the world we live in just is a world of insecurity, a world where we cannot be in charge of our future. And to suppose that we can, in a strange way, robs us of both the present and the future. I spend all my time and energy today protecting myself against a tomorrow that hasn't happened. I lose today for the sake of an unreal tomorrow. But if I know how to live today, and to be fed today by what is immediately around me, then actually I have some hope for tomorrow, because I am growing today towards an unknown tomorrow, and I will not be the same person tomorrow as I am today. But for that to be true, I have to live today. So turn that inside out. Instead of sacrificing today and tomorrow, why not inhabit today so as to grow towards tomorrow? Avarice is that reaching out and, again, grabbing this time the future and pulling it into the present moment, the ego's hungry stomach. Which has something also to do with lust. Again, Cassian and the other writers of the early church say there's nothing wrong as such about the sexual instinct. There it is, like the appetite for food. It's a given of our bodily life. Don't panic about that. A very stark contrast to one or two Western writers like St. Jerome around the same time, who are very definitely heavily invested in panicking about this. But the problem again becomes a problem of de-realizing, as we now say, reducing the reality of another person to your own desire, your own passion in the modern sense. What you're doing is not seeing another person as oriented towards God, the real, the true, the eternal, but you're seeing somebody else as oriented towards you, your desire, your gratification, your pleasure. You're hollowing out the reality of another person for your own gratification. And again in this analysis of the passions of the soul, the same pattern emerges as you can see. Passion is what canonizes the urge of the ego to pull the world into itself, a sort of black hole sucking reality into itself, and of course collapsing upon itself, not really relating or responding at all, but treating what's there simply as what is there to serve me. My priority, my agenda, is the heart of it. And lust, as much as avarice and gluttony, simply a variant of that. The early Christian writers, and indeed the early Muslim writers and the pagan writers as well, take for granted broadly a view of sexuality which most moderns would not accept. It's very much oriented to procreation and so on. Yet the fundamental analysis of how this goes wrong, I think, still rings some bells in terms of this misconception of the other as oriented just to me. The reality of somebody else is real insofar as it's real for me. That, whether it's with food or sex or money or whatever, that's what we have to let go of. The idea of a world that exists and has value because of me. And that begins to open a door on what I want to finish with in a few minutes' time. But just to round it off, the last two, envy and despair. Envy and despair. Envy is, above all, the refusal to be thankful for somebody else's good. Somebody else prospers, somebody else flourishes. And envy is not simply saying, I wish I were like that. It's saying, I wish they weren't like that. It's, again, the idea that somebody else's flourishing is a problematic and difficult thing because it makes me feel insecure. It makes me feel less. somebody else's good appears to make me feel less good. But what about the frame of mind in which it might be possible to look at somebody else flourishing and being happy and saying, now that is a gift for me? And somewhere in the background there is the way in which in the New Testament St. Paul can write, especially in 1 or 2 Corinthians, about how each local community of religious believers ought to feel augmented, enlarged, and enriched by the well-being of another community. And therefore, if they, who may be, the first community may be materially prosperous, help a second community, less materially prosperous, to flourish, that prosperity comes back as a gift to the first, and so it goes on in the kind of non-vicious circle. Something of that is in the background there. So envy, which is that refusal to be glad of the good of another, is something which, by blocking off the possibilities of thanksgiving and stopping up some of the sources of joy, can become, yet again, a source of not seeing, not being free. And ultimately, despair is, you might say, simply the mirror image of where you started with pride. These 8 habits have a kind of arc, beginning in pride, ending in despair. And my ending is despair, unless I be redeemed by prayer, as Prospero says at the end of the Tempest. The ending of despair, which is, I can't do anything. My pride, my self-reliance, is totally empty. But I've invested everything in the control of my ego, and if I let go of that, there's nothing. And that's as much a form of hellish alienation as pride itself. Because despair, the refusal to believe that I can be fed, that I can be given life, the acceptance, the embrace of that refusal, is again a disturbing passion, a distorting passion. As if, I've sometimes put it like this, as if you begin with pride, which says, I can never have been anything but right. You end with despair, which says, I can never have been anything but wrong. In between those two lies sanity. And somehow we have to find ways of discovering, living into that sanity. So that's a bit of a lightning tour of the 8 passions of the soul. But I hope I've helped to explain why that's not just about the 7 deadly sins. It's about habits, default settings, ways in which we try to cope with a complicated and often threatening world, that middle level, the life of the soul. Understand these, cope with these, and what happens is a kind of liberation that takes you to the state that the writers call apatheia. And, as I said, apathy is completely the wrong translation. Freedom from passion is one way of putting it. I think sometimes just freedom. One of the writers of the period says, apatheia is the gateway to love. If you have, in all these various ways, diagnosed and found ways of dealing with the compulsive ego-centeredness of all this, if you've confronted the fact that your coping strategies often rely on a deep illusion about your capacities as a person, if you get beyond that, what can happen is actually what we call love. That's to say, you're able to look at the otherness of things and persons and be glad of it as it is. Not to render it all in terms of what it means in relation to you. The essential thing about this kind of love is simply to let what is be what it is before anything else, and be glad of it. Things move on, changes happen, but start with that. And that's why Avarice of Magnus of Pontus, around 400, says that the diabolical way of looking at things is looking at things always in terms of how they fit into your agenda and your desires. And the angelic way of looking at things is looking at things as they relate to God. That is, as they come as gift and glory from the hand of God, from the sacred. And that's love, and that's freedom from passion. And that's where the life, complicated, turbulent life of the soul, which we were talking about, opens out most fully into the life of spirit, into the life of real receptivity and contemplation. I mentioned earlier the word theoria, looking. And in this tradition, theoria begins with the practical diagnosis of your habits of life. It moves on into what's called physicae theoria, literally natural contemplation, which is the awareness of the world around you, human and non-human, in the context of God, not in the context of yourself. And that awareness of the reality of what's around you, that generous and grateful awareness, then opens out onto what again the tradition calls theological contemplation, which doesn't mean burying your nose in the textbook of doctrine. It means that kind of looking which simply sees God, not as an object, but as an environment in which you are finally brought to the maximal life that's possible for you in true communion with what is around you, human and non-human. Well, I've overrun my time a bit, I fear, and I apologize for that. But I hope in this very sketchy survey I've given you some sense of what the care of the soul looks like in a particular strand of Christian, pre-Christian, Jewish, Muslim thinking, with lots more to say about the non-European world. But looking at that in terms of some of the, as I say, the diagnostic tools it offers, for looking at the ways in which we stop ourselves seeing clearly, responding and relating in a life-giving rather than a toxic and stifling way. And ultimately, it's about that capacity to get to the point where we can indeed swim or sing, or however you want to put it, in attunement with what is real, not as a battling ego seeking to impose itself on a recalcitrant, stubborn, or just passive world, but as a participant in something symphonic, mutual, an exchange of life, a circulation of the blood, as you might say, in the body of the universe. And if you have thoughts about all that, we can share them out of the break. Thanks for listening patiently.